Hello and welcome to Protocol's event on the era of the tech employee. I'm Tammy Wincup, President of Protocol, and I appreciate you joining us. Today, we are here to begin a conversation on the important role tech employees are playing, not only in helping to build tech products and companies, but in driving aligned ownership, values, and behavior, and to discuss what to do when leaders and employees are at odds. On Wednesday, Protocol will release our second tech employee survey. Our first last year focused on tech employees' attitudes on potential regulation. This week, we share tech employees' attitudes and opinions on the tech workplace. We look forward to sharing the results and our reporting with you. In a few minutes, Protocol's chief correspondent, Issie Lapowsky, and senior reporter, Megan Rose Dickey, have a great panel lined up, and I hope you will tweet your questions to #ProtocolWorkplace. Before then, I'd like to thank Zoom for being our launch partner for our workplace vertical, and to welcome Lynn Oldham, Chief People Officer of Zoom, to help us set the stage for this important conversation. Lynn, welcome. We're glad to have you here with us.
Thanks, Tammy. It's so exciting to be here. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Let's dive right in. Do you believe that this is the era of the tech employee?
Absolutely. I have no doubt that we really have unleashed a new aspect of talent. Employees are now empowered to make decisions about when, where, and how they produce. So that's going to have ramifications for employers. We've all been doing this for 16 plus months, give or take, right? And people have had epiphanies during this time frame: family time, remote work, commuting, passion projects, and what this all means, really. And I think that's really going to force employees and employers to think about that 9-to-5 office grind and whether it makes sense anymore. There's a lot out there. I'm glad to hear you're doing a survey. I've seen a lot of information in the airways, and employees themselves are taking to the airwaves just to say, especially if their employer has done something or has made a proclamation about how they're returning to work, and they're not being quiet about it. So there's definitely something in the air, and I think we're all experiencing it. And what a great time to sort of to be in the workforce, because if you know, there's not been anything like this that's changed the way we work in a very long time.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, and Zoom has been in the forefront of much of this, you know, with your really trajectory and growth over the last 18 months and 2 years. What has changed from your perch of what Zoom employees are seeking to have input on?
Yeah, that's a great question too. I think that, you know, just to set the stage, we entered the pandemic with 2,400 employees, and we're looking at over 5,000 today. So it's our culture that's really attracting people to join Zoom. And that culture is open and transparent. So we really do a lot of employee listening. We do surveys. We have an all hands every 2 weeks. So we're really getting people to talk about what they are desiring in their employment arrangement. So, and our employees are not shy, and we encourage that. So it's an opportunity for us to really allow them to talk to us about what they want, and we're listening.
So as a part of that, I know that you at Zoom have laid out, you know, established values around what you all talk about as community, customers, teammates, and self. And not just at Zoom, I presume, but across all technology companies, employees are increasingly asked for companies to drive real kind of social impact that are aligned to their own personal values. Can you give us some examples of what that has meant at Zoom and how you navigate that conversation?
Yeah, I think when I joined, which was just before our IPO, we had a happy crew. Our happy crew is a grassroots group of people, volunteers, all, I don't know, we're probably about 200 of them at this point, driving the social impact for the company. It was only this year that we added a head of social impact to really help, you know, pull that all together. But our employees are definitely wanting a say in not only customer matters, vendor matters, speakers that talk at the company, And as leaders, we have to take that on board, right? That's really critical for us to lead as leaders to listen to our employee base. And it's one piece of input as that we need to hear in how we make decisions, right? But it's not the only piece. But employees are a critical and important stakeholder. So we do a lot of listening. And I would say, if you want an example, I'll give you one where we did an event and we gave out a capstone gift around the event. And it was from a vendor that had some issues. So our employees were not quiet about it. They had a lot to say about the leadership of that company and how it was taking the company down a certain path. And we had to engage in that dialogue. It was not something we could just like sweep under the rug and say, we'll have none of that. We listened and we had increasing opportunity for employees to weigh in on those things.
Absolutely. I'm also interested, Lynn, in the fact that you have come to Zoom not from tech, right? You have led very large talent and culture teams across numerous different types of industries, whether it's agricultural or financial services. And I think that often we think about tech as unique in terms of building, but throughout history, powerful industries have had moments where employee voices have really driven change. Is what you're seeing at Zoom and in tech unique to tech, in your opinion? Is it different from what you saw happening in those two other industries?
It's interesting because I've been in banking, I've been in telecom, I've been all publishing. I think that tech, and it's hard to say because my career spanned 20 years, right? So, but I do think that it's not necessarily new and only to tech, but I just think the pandemic has created an environment that's shifted the balance of power right now and given the employee movement tailwinds. And those tailwinds are gale force. And I think that's what's really happening right now. And maybe in a good way. I mean, like I said earlier, we have not seen anything that has impacted work the way this pandemic has. So interesting, but I think that it's definitely a shift in the balance of power at this point in time.
Absolutely. Well, we appreciate you opening it up. We appreciate your partnership and for setting the stage from your perspective as Chief People Officer about where we are headed in the era of the tech employee. Thanks again for your time.
Thank
and
you,
I'd love
Tammy.
to welcome Issie and Megan and looking forward to the panel that they have.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lynn.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I am Issie Lapowsky, and I'm joined, as Tammy said, by my colleague, Megan Rose Dickey, and three really interesting panelists. And we're going to talk about this new age of employee empowerment that we're living through, talk about, what employees want from their companies and how leaders of those companies ought to respond. So we're joined today by Ifeoma Ozoma. She is a former public policy and social impact manager at Pinterest, who now runs a consulting firm focused on tech accountability and policy called Earthseed. Welcome, Ifeoma. We have Jack Poulson, who is a former senior research scientist at Google, and he now runs Tech Inquiry, which is a nonprofit group that produces a lot of interesting research on tech's financial and government ties. And last, we have David Barrett, who is CEO of the expense management company Expensify. And if you remember Expensify, you might remember that David sent a letter to 10 million customers before the election telling them to vote for Joe Biden. So interesting to talk to David about that. As Tammy said, if you have any questions, tweet them to us at the hashtag Protocol Workplace. And now I will kick it over to Megan.
Thank you, Issie. So Ifeoma, we wanted to kick off with you. And so for people who aren't familiar with your story, you came out last year on Twitter with another former colleague to talk about pay discrimination and retaliation that you experienced while working at Pinterest. Could you tell us a little bit about your experience trying to report those concerns inside the company and where the support you were looking for sort of broke down within Pinterest?
Yeah, thank you so much, Megan, Issie, and the rest of the protocol team. My story at Pinterest has been documented widely, and so I won't take a ton of time talking about it, but I did everything employees are told to do. I spoke to my manager, I spoke to my manager's manager, who's the general counsel and is still the general counsel at Pinterest. I raised a complaint with HR. I raised a complaint with the team that is supposed to work with employees within HR. I raised a complaint with the state of California. I did all of these things before I finally was pushed out of the company and then went public about my story. And so I think it's important to have systems and processes in place, but if the process is meant to keep employees from exercising their rights, from being paid fairly, from speaking up about illegal or harmful conduct that they're experiencing or witnessing in the workplace, then what good are the processes?
Absolutely. And so you said that you were inspired to speak out after seeing Pinterest post a Black Lives Matter statement after the murder of George Floyd last summer and found it hypocritical. So what does it mean to you for a company to really live up to that message that Black lives do matter? And are there any companies that you think are actually, talking the talk and walking the walk?
So no to your second question.
Okay.
To the first question, nothing gets me jazzed more than hypocrisy. And so although at some point I probably would have told my story, it was that date was moved up because of Pinterest statement. I think actually, I mean, you don't need to hire a chief diversity officer. You don't need someone from HR who has studied diversity at HBS or wherever else. It's quite simple. Pay people fairly. That seems like a pretty good baseline for saying that Black employees and Black lives matter. And then from there, we can have a conversation, but so many companies are not even doing that baseline under the floor, the bar doesn't exist step. And so there isn't a conversation to be had yet, and certainly not about the marketing focused diversity initiatives that many companies are currently engaged in.
Right. Jack, I wanted to bring you in because you resigned from Google in 2018 for your somewhat different reasons. It was after The Intercept reported that Google was experimenting with building a censored search engine for China. And I think this is something that a lot of tech companies and their employees are experiencing, these conflicts between the lines of business and worker expectations about what they're coming to work to do. So at Google, you obviously weren't the only person who disagreed with this project. So take us back a little bit to tell us how employees were responding internally and what Google's leadership was doing about that.
There can be some complication in concisely describing about 100,000 employees' opinions on this. There were a few different clusters of responses, I would say. Focusing on the workers that were concerned, I'd say the response was often to essentially defer explaining anything, because managers at, say, the more middle managers understood that employees were very concerned, and so there was a tactic to essentially compartmentalize all responsibility directly to Sundar, and that essentially led to weeks of delay. It was a bit exacerbated by a live tweeting of a company meeting that management then used as an excuse to delay discussing its actual position even longer. So I think it was, essentially employees just wanted to know how had the company decided to reverse its previous public stance. And maybe you could boil it down to wanting to understand what the company was actually even doing, because they had purposefully hidden what they understood employees might not like. And we could have broader conversations of how that might impact kind of ethics teams at companies more broadly. In this case, for example, there were even people on the privacy team who were famously kept out of the discussion because the company knew they would object.
And did you get the sense that the company was receptive to this employee feedback, or like what kind of signals were you getting from them?
The response was to waffle essentially and to say that this was a complicated decision. The company, essentially took an engineering perspective. It took a while for them to kind of find their footing of how they wanted to market it, but essentially it was a reversal back to the pre-2010, I think 2007, 2010 timeframe, where famously Eric Schmidt had argued that the company did a quote evil scale, and they decided that it was more evil to not provide their services than it was to suppress some of these basic human rights. So I would frame that in terms of the company arguing its products were more important than fundamental human rights. And so essentially Sundar realized that the company could revert to that stance, or at least it attempted to revert to that stance. And then in a meeting, in fact, at Wired's 25th anniversary, in an interview, Sundar was asked about the project, and he used this really troublesome language that the company was, delivering more than 99% of queries, is the way he framed it. So he started to adopt a very machine learning-esque framing of what it meant to respect civil liberties, as if it's okay to suppress 1% of queries. And obviously the bulk of internet traffic is fairly mundane, and some of the most important traffic, whether that's human rights inquiry, et cetera, might fall into that 1%. And so I found it just really irresponsible. And thankfully I didn't see him repeat it later, but to be clear, to this day, the company has never said that that type of activity violates its standards.
Mm-hmm. So I want to get at sort of the employee, pushback, and you were obviously one of those people. And the competition for talent in Silicon Valley is so aggressive. So you would imagine that Google would not want to lose someone like you. So tell me a little bit about what made you decide to leave, and then also on the flip side, was there anything that you felt like at the time, if they had just done this, I would have been able to stay?
So my framing on this comes from more of the labor stance of having, even in academia, when I needed to negotiate fair wages, it took brinksmanship. I doubled my salary when I was a grad student one day in 15 minutes by saying I was going to leave if I didn't get the same pay that other employees got. So I've understood for a long time that if you're not willing to put your job on the line, you're leaving a lot on the table. And that was certainly true at Google. For example, when I moved to Canada, they tried to cut my salary by 40% by arguing that was a difference in local kind of cost of living, which anyway, never mind that they do the same thing in London, England, which is clearly not cheaper. So eventually, things get around and you start to have the kind of brass tacks discussion when any real money is on the line. And so given that Google wasn't unionized or had no real significant union power at the time, there were certainly transparency movements, but I was a bit disconnected. My understanding of my actual labor power was my job. Not to overstate how senior I was, senior research scientist is a lot less senior than you might think. For example, a staff research scientist is more senior than a senior research scientist. But nevertheless, in the past, that was the only place I got traction, and I indeed did get a bit of traction. But to be clear, this is like about billions and billions of dollars of revenue. And I was nowhere near senior enough for that, though I did get a meeting with the head of AI research. And, at the time, I think people didn't really believe what I was quoting him as saying. And I think after the scandal with Google firing Dr. Gebru, I think people understand a bit more how these people behave. But at the time it was, even though I got it into the New York Times that Jeff Dean had told me, like, look, the US does the same thing that China does through FISA warrants effectively. So why are you asking us, not to suppress human rights inquiry? That was considered fairly unbelievable at the time. So to some degree, I feel vindicated by some of the you know, the more enlightened view to what tech ethics is now.
Mhm. And before we bring David in, do you feel like if that conversation with Jeff Dean had gone differently, that would have changed your mind? Or was it a matter of the, sort of the substance of Google, you know, investing in a product like this that was, you know, gonna make your decision?
Well, to be clear, my managers tried to frame me even having the right to meet with this holiest of engineers as sort of a compromise in itself, which I was quite clear in the setup that it was not, and that my only concern was whether or not the company went through with this project. So clearly that was their concern, whereas I, you know, who cares who I got to meet with? What I care about is what sorts of harms the company might be perpetrating that I would be directly profiting from, as someone who was mostly paid in stock, which is true of anyone at a sufficient level. So hopefully that answers your question.
Sure.
Yeah, so we've heard a lot from the tech employee perspective, but David wanted to bring you in from the leadership perspective, and of course talk about the email Issie mentioned earlier that you sent out to your 10 million customers before the election. You encouraged them to vote for Joe Biden, which is not a trivial thing. So was this something that your staff was pushing you to do, or how did you land on that decision?
Well, first off, I'd say I would hope to lump myself in with this sort of tech employee perspective, because I'd say like my background, I've been a programmer since I was 6, computer graphics, PDP engineering my whole life. And I think that all the concerns raised here were the reason I started Expensify. Like, I think these are so universal, these sorts of problems, and like the kind of casual discrimination is so just normalized in the workplace. It's incredibly frustrating throughout the entire thing. So when I started Expensify, I was like, hey, maybe we can do things different. And it's required actually changing not just like a couple of things about the company, but virtually everything about the company. And so like we were talking about, for example, pay discrimination, and like how do you solve that and kind of like verifiably solve that? It's super hard in a world with systemic racism where literally every single player is biased. So it's like, oh, that makes it a tough one. So like our solution, which is kind of weird and radical, is we vote on our compensation. We actually built our own voting tool internally, where basically we show, it'll pick up a random pair of employees. It's like, you know, Alice and Bob, and it'll show their metrics next to each other, the product they worked on, things like this. And it'll say, who do you think should be paid more, Alice or Bob? Bob or Kathy? You do that about 8,000 times, you rank the whole company. Everyone in the company does this, and this produces an incredibly highly diversified data set of basically who is creating value from the perspective of everyone else in the company. And what's nice about this is it means there is no manager that has a thumb over you. There's no one to like, you know, fear or, you know, suck up to or whatever that is. And so we think that we can do with a tool like this, again, a decent job of kind of controlling for internal bias. But of course, as I mentioned, like we're a product of society. Society has its own problems. And so on the other side, we created this is kind of riffing here a little bit, but like we created a justice fund, basically saying like we're going to donate 25 cents for every dollar we pay white male employees. We do it to a fund of a nonprofit we created called Expensify.org, which is pretty creative. And then this justice fund basically funds campaigns devoted to unwinding systemic racism. In fact, today we just announced there's a voting competition where like anyone can go on to Expensify.org and then vote for which campaigns they think should get the most funds and the process there. So I'd say, kind of going back, and this I'm building up to your answer here, but I'd say this idea of trying to bring justice into the company and trying to push back on the traditional constraints of hierarchy is, yes, something that employees are pushing for, but they're not pushing against anyone. We're all just pushing in the same direction. And this requires building a company that has the DNA of challenging these sort of power structures at the root level. And so I'd say when it sort of build up to the election for Trump, and it's basically there's a lot of anxiety internally. Now there's a wide diversity of opinions. We've got Republicans, Independents, we got like everyone in the company. But we've been going through so many different internal conversations about diversity, about ethics and things like this, and what are our values, and how do we document them, and how do we train people on them and hire appropriately on them. So by the time it came to this election, this wasn't like the first conversation we'd ever had internally on a hard topic. This was like the 10th. And so as a result, everything follows the same process internally. Like everyone follows the same process to get anything done. It's like I posted what I call a problem solution statement. It's basically, it's like, problem, democracy as we know it is faltering, and that's going to create a bad business environment for expense reports. Like, not many expense reports get submitted in a civil war. And so they're like, solution, let's push back on Trump being elected, because I think there's a real chance that if it's not a clear win for Biden, then he will refuse to give up power and could actually plunge us into a genuine civil war. And at the time when I posted this, like, the September before the election, whatever it was, everyone's like, that's ridiculous. That is just so preposterous. What kind of president would ever refuse to leave and challenge the legitimacy of an election? And we got a lot of pushback in this, but internally, so we sort of raised this problem. And then there was a whole bunch of discussion internally. And it's basically like, I posted a draft in the newsletter. I was like, hey, here's what I think we should send. What do you think? And then everyone in the company jumped in to edit it, fact checked it, and things like this. There's a bunch of decisions back and forth. And then at the end, it came down to sort of a vote in the company. It's like, all right, what do you think? Should we do it? Should we not do it? And then it came down to, if we get a super majority support for it, then we're going to go for it. And so I would say, even though, like, the one regret I think I have from the whole process is that it was signed with my name, which makes it seem very much like it's my decision or my message. But this was very much a company message. And we felt very proud of it. And I think to this day, we feel incredibly proud of, like, everyone else is standing around and saying, it's like, man, you seeing this? You know how crazy this shit is? It's like, is anyone going to do anything? And we're like, I don't know, maybe we can do something. I know we're an expense reporting company, and you wouldn't normally think that would weigh in an election, but we do have a mailing list of 10 million people, and those are our voters. And so let's do what we can. And I think overwhelmingly, the reaction was positive. Now, that's like, there's a very small vocal minority of people that were like freaking out. But the overwhelming majority of our customers were like, thank you for standing up for, democracy, for freedom. It's like it sounds like cliche that these need defending, but they do. Like, someone needs to do something about it. And I think brands that are willing to actually put their money where the mouth is and step into a controversial decision when necessary, I think that, that those are strong brands that customers, users, and especially employees really rallied behind. I mean, throughout the process, we didn't lose a single employee. Like, no one quit over this, but we did get a huge number of applicants.
And so, I mean, it sounds like, I mean, even just earlier, what you were saying is that, like, you kind of want to lump yourself in with this, like, era of the empowered employee. And it sounds like you're saying, like, okay, like, I'm a different kind of CEO. Like, I'm not like these other people. And so, and then you were talking about how there's this process for where employees can kind of, I guess, almost vote on how other people are paid, and people have access to that information. And so I guess, yeah, what I'm getting at is, if Ifeoma worked at Expensify, do you think something like she would have had a different experience than she did at Pinterest?
I mean, I would hope to say yes. I mean, who knows? And I can't claim that, like, we're perfect. We're very much like a work in progress here. I guess I would say, but I can guarantee that we're trying hard. And I think that most importantly, that comes down to, like, listening and acknowledging problems, and acknowledging that we are part of a system that is a complicated system with hundreds of years of history behind it. I mean, thousands or millions, depending how far you want to go back. And I think that making a real effort is, like, table stakes, and being willing to sort of challenge your assumptions and do something about it. Like, I know it's very popular right now. There's this whole wave of it's like, oh, we should to support the digital nomad, we should pay people, regardless of where they work. It's like, well, we've been doing that forever. Like, that's like, we've concluded very early on that. So we pay everyone according to San Francisco wages. So if you're in San Francisco, you live a very comfortable lifeline. If you live literally anywhere else in the world, it's amazing. And so, because we concluded that the freedom to travel is like a key part of basically the employee experience. And so being able to live in a neighborhood of your choice is a key part about enabling a diverse workforce. And so we recruit from a global basis all over the world, every continent. And so as a result, we think that decisions about, like, how you hire, how you interview people, how you compensate people, and who makes those compensation decisions, all of these lead into what it takes to make a diverse workforce. And that's not like diversity for, like, I think there's a term here used like marketing diversity, or like, and I think that's it's a huge risk. I know that you talk to investors about this concept of ESG and like environmental, society, and governance, and it almost has like a bad ring to it. People, it's just so cynical anymore. Like corporate social responsibility is just like a euphemism for basically like greenwashing or whitewashing. And so I think that it takes a tremendous amount of patience to actually walk the walk and do the work, and it takes a lot of creativity. And so I can't guarantee we'd have a better result, but I guarantee that we would at least try.
Well, I'd love to put it to Ifeoma. I'd love your response to sort of the approach that David's been describing, both with regard to pay equity, but then also this approach that he took with the election. Like, is that something that you think we should be seeing more of from companies? And is that something that you think they went about in the right way? I ask you because you're not just a former employee, but you also consult with companies. They look to you for guidance on these sorts of topics.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know anything about what Expensify has been doing, and so I think it's really interesting to hear. There's so many things that, David, you said that I found fascinating. You are at respectfully management still. You are not a worker or an employee. And I wish Lynn was still here, because she made a comment about Zoom's culture being open and transparent. And I was hearing a lot of that in what you were saying as well: transparency through the voting tool, transparency in the way you all make decisions. And I think an important part of transparency as well is some of the work that I've been pushing for in the state of California and outside of California to reform NDA laws, because at the end of the day, I think it's great to be transparent within a company. There are people, because of their roles within your company and others, that will never feel they have the ability to speak up about situations they're in. And since you're a work in progress, I have a question for you, David, actually. And it's whether you would be willing, as the person who the buck stops with, to go ahead and change the policies that Expensify has right now around NDAs and their use in employment agreements, whether those are separation agreements or at the beginning of work. And I'll drop it in the chat, but for the people who are watching, there's actually a really simple sentence, easy to understand. You don't need to be a lawyer to get it. That's in the bill that I'm co-sponsoring right now. And that would be required to be in these agreements. But I think it's important to have these protections beyond California, since you said you all hire folks outside of San Francisco. And the sentence is, nothing in this agreement prevents you from discussing or disclosing information about unlawful acts in the workplace, such as harassment or discrimination or any other conduct that you have reason to believe is unlawful.
Sounds great. Sign me up. I mean, I can't believe that's already not obvious.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, that's why we have conversations like this, and I'll drop it in the chat so you can share it with your general counsel, who's probably a bit nervous right now that you're agreeing. But these are the conversations we need to have. And I think the letter that you sent about Biden is great. This is the type of thing that we need to see in the workplace, beyond statements, beyond the donations that you all are doing, because at the end of the day, people need protections. And that's what this is about. That's what my work is about. So it would be great to see follow up from you as well on how you all are implementing this, both for your full-time employees as well as any contractors you may be hiring.
Yeah, I mean, I think whistleblowing is a key part of oversight. I mean, like, it's whether you look at different like the NICE or NASDAQ sort of audit committee rules, and like whistleblowing is a big part of being a public company. Like, you can't go public without that kind of thing. And so I think that, yeah, it's shocking that that wouldn't already be enshrined in law. But yeah, it seems like that's a really obvious thing.
Well, you guys heard it here first. Expensify and Ifeoma, breaking news. And just in case anybody out there isn't familiar with Ifeoma's bill, it's called the Silenced No More Act in California. She's done some great writing on it in the New York Times, so you can look up her op-ed there. Jack, I wanted to bring you in. same question. What are your thoughts on this approach to pay discrimination, the approach to sort of taking the pulse of the employee base in this way on big decisions, right? Not something you necessarily experienced at Google, but I would love your thoughts on that.
So a few thoughts. One, that would best be done through negotiation with a union as opposed to informally through a poll. And so I think commitments to voluntarily recognize employee unions along the same lines as what Ifeoma was just talking about are critical. Unfortunately, even some of the most hallowed civil liberties organizations sometimes don't do that. I won't name names, but I think those in the know understand what I'm talking about right now. So that's one. Another would be that I think there can often be a bit too much focus on public statements as opposed to actual corporate activity. And so what I mean by that is, well, protocols, part of Politico. Politico covers corporate lobbying in quite a lot of detail. You know, in the past, we've had things like Palantir's CEO writing op-eds about what it means to do politics in the workplace and saying the company won't engage in any policy making, and yet at the same time it's spending millions of dollars per year on corporate lobbying to change the law in the ways that benefit its company. And then at the same time, many of these companies are also dodging their taxes. And so I think I get concerned, and this is not addressing Expensify at all, frankly, because as far as I'm aware, you're not a public company, and so I can't look at what your effective tax rate is. But for public companies, I think there's not enough discussion of corporate lobbying and tax dodging. And I would tie this in. There was a recent interview that Sundar did with the BBC where the interviewer, about 45 minutes in, prodded in a similar way to how Ifeoma just did, which, all respect, and asked Sundar if he would commit on the spot to pulling Google out of corporate tax havens, and he refused. Maybe not surprisingly. So I think there needs to be more of that kind of pressure as opposed to more, all respect to, living your values. But I think for bigger companies, they tend to use that as a shield as opposed to is a way to divert attention away from the things that actually affect their bottom line.
Like Megan said, walking the walk.
Yeah, exactly. And so, because Jack, you mentioned just like the role of unions in tech, and Ifeoma, obviously, I mean, while you were there, Pinterest did not have a union, but and I guess they still don't, or at least it's not public. But I guess after you came out and spoke about your experience along with your former colleague, Erica Shimizu-Banks, their workers staged a walkout in protest of your treatment. And so how did it feel to see that as a response? And I guess, like, how confident are you in the power of collective action?
I'm incredibly confident in the power of collective action, but I'm also confident that the company is doing everything it can to squash any sort of collectivism. After I spoke up, after Erica spoke up, Francoise, the former COO, second in command at the company, who was pushed out under very similar circumstances as Erica and me. After we spoke up, the company made changes to the way employees can interact on Slack, where they can ask questions on Slack. I heard that Ben is scared shitless about employees unionizing. So I hope someone from the comms team who is still following everything I do goes ahead and tells him that I'm aware that he's afraid. I am encouraged that there are employees there who care and are doing everything they can to work together, to continue to ask questions, to share things that are going on within the company. Where I'm concerned, and the reason why I think it is really important to codify both in law and in actual policies within companies, things like the language that I brought up from the Silence No More Act, is that the employee base at many companies, Pinterest included, is so separated that there isn't a way to effectively organize under the current structures that we have for unions within the US. You could be working next to someone who you believe is a full-time employee, but actually is not an employee of Pinterest. They're an employee of a contracting company under sketchy circumstances because they're doing the exact same thing you are, but somehow they're a contractor. And so while those things are in place, while communication is segmented such that you're siloed in a way that's similar really to the Theranos story, even though that was so extreme that everyone looked at it as, oh, wow, that's crazy, what's going on there? That sort of thing is going on in many places, Google, Pinterest, Facebook included. And so, yes, encouraged by collectivism, but I also know how hard it is within companies because management is really scared about having unions.
Yeah, David, I mean, how do you feel about unions? It's like if your workers came to you and said, hey, like we want you to recognize our union, would you willingly recognize it?
Yeah, I mean, my reaction would be like, man, I'm so sorry. Like, I don't know what I did to I fucked up somehow along the way. That's what anyone would feel was the correct solution. I mean, I think that the union is a really important solution to a problem, but it's also a recognition that there was a problem to be solved in the first place. And so I would say any company where there are employees that are unionizing, it's like, man, you got to listen. Like, this is so far down the path where you should have solved that problem way before you get to that point. And so if you're to a point where your employees are unionizing, I think you have to really acknowledge and sort of internalize and accept that it's there is a real systemic problem here that needs to be solved. And if you're to that point, the union might be the best solution for it.
I have a really quick comment to make on that. Sure. That I think your understanding of unions is a common one, but it's a misconception. We have a Bill of Rights, and we have rights that are codified for a reason, not because you have to wait until said right is violated to then reference the document. A union and the purpose of a union is not to be in conflict with management. It's to ensure that workers have a seat at the table. It's to ensure that workers have their voices heard in a way that that is not the same for everyone. Jack talked about being able to speak up as a grad student, and then his pay doubled. He and I are going to have very different conversations with a manager because of how we present, because of who we are, if we have the exact same conversation using the exact same words. And so while I understand your understanding of unions, I would encourage you to reframe it a little bit to understand that if your workers came to you, that doesn't mean anything is in conflict. They may love working at Expensify and want to ensure that if you were to be hit by a bus and someone else were to become the CEO of Expensify, they retain the rights and they retain the culture that you have said you've established.
That makes sense. That's a good clarification. Thank you for that. And I guess I would say if ideally there would already be that confidence and insurance there. And so I would say I don't think we should wait for employees to unionize before taking their concerns seriously and giving them that confidence and conviction. And even for things like, at Expensify, if someone comes and it's like, hey, I need to double my wages, I'd be like, look, I'm not the guy. I'm just one vote in this entire thing. You have to convince the whole company to get behind it, sort of thing. And so I'd say our solution towards things is there is really, we trust employees implicitly with our most delicate of decisions around compensation, around, should we engage politically? Should we, how should we fund our nonprofit and things like this? And so we've already tried to get ahead of that to say, it's no, we view ourselves very much an employee-driven company, and we've taken steps to disempower management, such as myself. I don't have the power to do a lot of things that a lot of CEOs do by design, and that's a good thing. And so I'd say, yes, I think, I didn't mean to diminish the importance of the union's role in ensuring sort of access to employee rights, just to say, I don't think you should wait to that. I think you can get ahead of that and build that into the foundation of the company itself.
David, just staying with you, another, I think, area of feedback that a lot of tech leaders are getting right now is how employees want to work. After we've gone through this year of remote work, we're hearing a lot more from workforces saying, I want the ability to work from anywhere, or I want flexible work schedule because now I have a certain kind of rhythm with my kids. How is Expensify seeking that feedback from employees, and what are you doing with that information?
Sure. Well, I mean, we've offices in like Melbourne, San Francisco, Portland, Michigan, London, New York, and so we got, and then plus that was when offices met. And that now everyone's just like scattered to the four winds. They're just all over the place. I have no idea where everyone works. And I think that, but we've embraced kind of this remote first work style for a long time. And I think that the real challenge is building all of your processes in such a fashion that they're inclusive by design, not by accident. So it means it's like decisions are slowed down, things are written down, conversations happen in Slack, where you have a 24-hour time cycle as opposed to like a chat, which is a real time, things like this. And so I'd say, first and foremost, employees should work wherever they want to work, and you should have processes which enable them to do so. That said, I'm not convinced everyone wants to work from home. I think that the ability to work from home when you choose is a great freedom, but it's like the obligation to work from home kind of sucks after a while. And so I think that our approach is we're taking the pandemic to, we're renovating all of our offices and adding like really high-end, so basically, as an aside, every year we take the whole company overseas for a month, families, kids, everyone. And so we were like in Hanoi, and I was like reflecting, like, what is it about this Hanoi coffee shop that employees love? It's so much more productive environment than our multi-million-dollar office. Like that doesn't make any sense. And so like, well, this Hanoi coffee shop has 1, really awesome coffee, 2, it has cocktails, and 3, it has strangers. And so we're actually going through and we're renovating all of our offices to put in high-end cocktail bars, nice coffee shops with a barista, and the ability to invite all of your friends to work alongside with you. And so I think it's about trying to really challenge the necessity of a lot of things in the workplace and say, like, what do people really want? And not just by what the polls say, like, what do their behaviors show? Are they going to coffee shops? Why are they going to coffee shops? Why is that coffee shop better than the workplace? And so basically trying to be responsive to people in those ways.
Mm-hmm. And what about other precautions around COVID, vaccine mandates, mask mandates? How are you dealing with employee feedback on that?
Well, I think mostly we're just following government guidance. Our offices are, I guess, actually San Francisco just recently reopened, but we require through a portal to upload your vaccine proof. And so we're just basically, it's like, look, we are not virologists. And so we're just going to trust the CDC in this.
Got it. Jack, bringing you back in, you worked with some investors last year to put forward a shareholder resolution that would basically review whistleblower protections at Alphabet. This was a shareholder resolution that was reintroduced this year. What sort of protections are you looking for at the company level? And then also same question for at the government level.
Yeah, be happy to answer that. If I could circle a bit back on the union topic. Mm-hmm. I brought it up because I care about it and there's a bit to say. So I'm no historian by any means, but I think it's critical to look back to the history of Hewlett-Packard and its role in setting kind of the broader approach to what it means to kind of negotiate with workers explicitly to prevent their unionization, which was again quite explicit part of the way Packard approached, kind of providing employees with this cushy lifestyle. And I think that's part of why we see such immense, comforts for workers, is that it is part of this deal that was kind of hinted at and a bit retracted earlier, which is that you shouldn't have a union until things are sufficiently bad. And I would say if you look at the copy of the Society for Human Resource Managers, which, companies like Google have members on the board of, they even have explicit pages on how you prevent unions. And it's through things like, ensuring one-on-one communication with the manager. And, basically these niceties are often framed explicitly as how you prevent a union. And I think we need to know the history there, that it actually comes from a very reactionary right-wing, history, for example, David Packard. Anyway, so on your question of whistleblower protections, like, look, there's a question of what it is that you get to say without at least being afraid that you're going to have a lawsuit served on you. And there's, to be clear, a very big gap between what potentially could happen, which you find out quickly when you hire a lawyer, and what it is that you could reasonably assume to happen, which you learn through experience. And Google and companies like that don't tend to sue people very often, but that's very different than someone who just gave up their income, being concerned that they're in a vulnerable place and they might be sued out of existence by a giant corporation. And so I think it's something that is critical that employees be able to speak out on information that's in the public interest, that regardless of what NDAs they might have. And in my case, selfishly, that is something like, potentially me having disclosed blacklisted terms that I saw internally, which was something I was afraid of doing. More broadly, there's issues like workplace harassment, et cetera. And I would say that there's an important, context to the question of the shareholder resolution, which is who is the proper civil society oversight once you have ethical objections. I think we could get into a debate over the degree to which a union should be able to monopolize that discussion. We can also get into the debate of the degree to which any particular multi-stakeholder organization should get to monopolize that discussion, outside of the company. And say, in particular, I'm thinking of an organization like the Global Network Initiative. Anyway, that's a tangent.
Ifeoma, just back to you for a second. You put out a tweet actually before, or actually we put out a tweet before this event asking whether whether a company can live out both its values as a company and the values of its employees. You replied saying that you reject that premise since companies don't have values, but managers do. And so why is that a distinction that matters?
I think it's a distinction that matters for many reasons, but especially because there are many managers and many in management who find it convenient to hide behind the company, while those who have been harmed by their actions have to speak with their names, with their entire records. And so I think it's an important thing, especially when speaking with journalists, and Issie knows how much I push back on certain things, you do as well, that you are making sure that you're identifying the individuals at companies who are making decisions. Because if you stand by that decision, because you stand by the culture of your company, then you should be willing to put your name on it. So that is the main reason why I say that. But then also because, especially in the context of the work that I've been doing on NDA reform and many other issues, at the end of the day, companies are not human beings. They're human beings making all of these decisions, whether it's to have an equitable workplace or to have an unequal workplace, whether it's to force people into silence or whether it's to allow transparency to flourish and to allow accountability to take place. And so we need to acknowledge that there are individuals. There isn't just the behemoth that is Google. There's a general counsel at the end of the day who's making a decision, and there's a CEO who's signing off on them.
Yeah, David, I'm curious how that lands with you. Do you generally agree that companies don't have values, but managers and the leaders at those companies do?
Yeah, I mean, companies aren't sentient, but people are. And I totally agree with putting a name to the decisions. It's like I've never shied away from making it clear what my opinions are or hid behind the council for anything like this. But yeah, so I think I agree with all that.
Yeah, and so obviously, I mean, we've touched on this throughout the conversation, but I think a hot topic just throughout this last year has been, whether political talk and talking about social issues in the workplace should be allowed. Like we've seen companies like Coinbase and Basecamp say, no, like none of these discussions are allowed. And then we've seen employees then leave those companies, especially in the case of Basecamp. And David, so it seems safe to say that you do think that this type of discussion should be allowed to happen in the workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the idea that somehow companies are, separate from society is just crazy, or like that a third of your life that you spend in the workplace or whatever it is a place that you can't be yourself, because if yourself includes any sort of political viewpoint, which everything's political, like you can't avoid politics. It's just a part of being human. And so I don't know, I think that that's a kind of a crazy idea. And I think that it's a very anti-democratic idea. I think that the fundamental pillars of democracy are under attack by a huge range of interests right now. And I think that we need employees and companies to step up in support of these, of the freedom of speech and democracy and participating in your civic obligations and things like this. And this shouldn't be radical. The idea that democracy itself has become politicized is just terrifying. And I think that I'm sure there's a line between, like, you know, where companies should chime in and shouldn't. I don't really know exactly where that line is, but I think we're so far past that line. The issues that we're talking about are so fundamental that they need democracy, or they need participation. Like, I saw this great poster, and it's like, what would you do in the rise of authoritarianism? And it's like, you're doing it right now. And I think that that's absolutely true. Like, whatever you're doing right now is, you know, that's your response to the rise of fascism. And so we need as many partners as possible to push back on this.
Well, Jack and Ifeoma, I just want to return to you before we wrap up. Obviously, speaking out, Ifeoma, in your case about mistreatment, Jack, in your case about, you know, certain misgivings that you have about the way the company was operating, not an easy thing to do. So Jack, starting with you, what advice do you have to other tech workers who witness or experience these issues in the workplace, but may fear repercussions? What advice do you have for those people?
Learn how to dig to understand what your company is doing, because they're often going to hide the most controversial things from you. Learn who has power, learn how to connect with them. And I'd say that gets you pretty far.
And same question to you, Ifeoma.
Everything that Jack said, and also learn when it's in your interest to speak up and not. I've talked about this publicly on many occasions. If I had children who I was supporting through my health insurance, I would not be here talking today because I would not have spoken up. And that would have been the right decision for me to take care of my family in a capitalist society where I would need to retain my compensation and my insurance. But I think it's important for folks to understand that no one needs to be a martyr, and no one should be martyring themselves or their families in a system that is oppressive. So do what you can within your means.
Right. And while we're on you, Ifeoma, just because we had brought up the Silence No More Act, obviously we've got Expensify on board now. I know that Pinterest had come out. They made a statement in support of it. Any other feedback from any other companies, or any message you would like to send to those companies today if they have not yet spoken out about it?
Yeah, well, Pinterest said that they support the bill, but actually what David said is more concrete than anything that Ben has said from Pinterest. I'd like to see things codified, so I want to see it in writing somewhere that you are adopting this policy for your full-time and your contract employees. So as far as that goes, no company has done that yet, although I'm encouraged and expect to see it from David and Expensify. But yeah, that's where we are. Companies and the individuals who run companies, again, going back to my earlier point, are very much invested in not having accountability, and that hurts shareholders, it hurts customers, it hurts employees.
Well, hopefully you guys have given some leaders in the tech industry a lot to think about, and hopefully some advice to workers who are, facing similar circumstances. So thank you all for your time. I really appreciate it. And for everybody watching, we have another event planned on Wednesday. Totally different topic. It's about autonomous vehicles, robots, and sensor technology, but still interesting stuff. So please tune in then.